Welcome to the Pencil Bob channel. I hope you enjoy my stories.
The saga of Dolly Man wasn't just a chuckle-worthy tale. It was a glorious reminder of what happens when petty power trips collide with someone who refuses to roll over. I remember my coworker, Tim, recounting the entire ordeal while we were hunched over a server rack in a sweltering office in Tempe, Arizona. Tim's voice was brimming with equal parts amusement and fury. "You ever hear about Dolly Man?" he asked, a mischievous grin for me. When I shook my head, he launched into the kind of story that makes you want to simultaneously laugh, cry, and set something on fire. It all started with APS, a company notorious in Tempe for its predatory parking enforcement tactics. They weren't just strict, they were vultures circling their prey, ready to swoop in and slap a boot on anything with four wheels. Their favorite stomping grounds? HOA neighborhoods. Naturally, APS and HOAs went together like gasoline and a matchstick, fueling misery for anyone unfortunate enough to live in their jurisdiction. Dolly Man, DM as we'll call him, was just a guy living his life, minding his own business, until APS decided to mess with him. One afternoon, DM had parked his car in front of his own house for what must have been all of 5 minutes. He wasn't blocking a fire hydrant or anyone's driveway. Heck, he wasn't even idling on the street. But APS, being the opportunistic scavengers they were, slapped a boot on his car like it was a national emergency. DM was stunned when he stepped outside to find his car immobilized. He called APS to try to sort it out. Surely, this was a mistake, right? But no, APS doubled down, insisting he had violated some obscure rule they wouldn't even clearly define. Their smugness practically oozed through the phone, their only solution being for him to pay up. DM then turned to his HOA for backup, thinking, surely they'll have my back. This is neighborhood, after all. But the response he got was a masterclass in indifference. When he presented the issue, the HOA's president barely looked up from her phone, giving some dismissive excuse about how they don't get involved in disputes with APS. It was clear they weren't interested in helping him at all. Instead of stepping up for one of their own residents, they acted like this was DM's fault for not parking in the right spot, though no such rule existed in the first place. What really raised eyebrows, though, was when they circled back to the subject of payment. The HOA tried to pressure DM into just paying APS to make the problem go away, claiming that it would keep the peace and save him the hassle of further disputes. But DM wasn't obligated to pay a dime, and he knew it. This wasn't about rules or fairness. This was about control. The more DM thought about it, the more their response felt suspicious. Why would the HOA be so eager to push him to pay APS instead of defending him? It almost seemed like they had something to gain from siding with the parking company. The HOA's utter refusal to challenge APS on his behalf, and their uncanny willingness to encourage payment, made DM start wondering if kickbacks might be involved. After all, APS seemed to operate freely in the neighborhood, and the HOA's hands-off attitude looked less like disinterest and more like complicity. That's when DM decided he wasn't going to play their game. Instead of coughing up the fine, he marched to his garage and grabbed 4 dollies, the kind you'd use to move heavy furniture. With precision and calm defiance, he ratcheted one under each tire of his booted car, rolled it into his garage, and shut the door. Then, in a move that would become the stuff of neighborhood legend, he called APS and said, "I'm not paying your ridiculous fine, but you're welcome to come pick up your boot whenever you'd like. Just let me know." APS, of course, lost their minds. They weren't used to people standing up to them, let alone pulling a stunt this audacious. For a company built on intimidation and compliance, this was practically an insult to their entire operation. Their first move was to call the police, breathlessly claiming that DM had stolen their boot and demanding immediate action. When an officer arrived at DM's house, APS must have thought they had the upper hand. But that illusion crumbled the moment DM calmly explained the situation. "They're welcome to come and get it any time," DM said with a shrug, standing by his garage. "I'm not holding it hostage, I just don't owe them anything." The officer, clearly unimpressed by APS's hysterics, turned to their representative and asked, "Do you want the boot back or not?" It wasn't the dramatic showdown APS had likely envisioned. Flustered, their representative stammered, unable to come up with a response that didn't make them look ridiculous. The officer, probably irritated at having been dragged into this nonsense, let the silence linger before finally telling APS they could retrieve the boot whenever they wanted. But APS didn't move. They couldn't. Acknowledging the offer to take back the boot would mean admitting they had no legal basis to be there in the first place. Instead, they left empty-handed, their credibility bruised, and the boot stayed exactly where DM had stashed it, in his garage, a trophy of their humiliation. From there, things escalated quickly. APS tried everything to force DM's hand. They started calling the police repeatedly, tweaking their story each time. Once, they waited until DM was at work and then told the cops he was refusing to give them the boot because he wasn't home to hand it over. The officers saw through the nonsense and refused to play along. Meanwhile, DM's little act of rebellion started gaining traction online. He posted his story on a few local forums, and people went wild. The whole city seemed to rally around him, laughing at APS's inability to handle a situation of their own making. The cherry on top? Some random entrepreneur started printing Dolly Man t-shirts, complete with a cartoonish illustration of a car on dollies. APS tried to pin this on DM, accusing him of profiting from illegal activities. But DM wasn't even remotely involved in the merch. APS's frustration boiled over. If they couldn't get their boot back through brute force, they'd try to take DM to court. They threw the book at him, alleging slander, theft, and even threats of violence, all of which were completely fabricated. Their lawyer waved screenshots of online comments around like they were damning evidence, claiming DM was inciting a mob. DM initially represented himself in court, and it didn't take long to see how lopsided the fight was. APS's legal team came in guns blazing, armed with a pile of documents, exaggerated claims, and what seemed like endless resources to throw at the case. They painted DM as a rogue troublemaker, twisting every action he'd take him into something sinister. It was overwhelming, and without a lawyer, DM struggled to keep up with their aggressive tactics. The courtroom felt less like a place for justice and more like a battleground where APS was determined to crush him. But DM wasn't about to roll over. Recognizing the need for backup, he hired a lawyer, and that's when the tide began to shift. With a professional in his corner, APS's flimsy arguments started to crumble under scrutiny. Their grand claims about DM stealing the boot were picked apart until it was obvious they didn't have a leg to stand on. The absurdity of their accusations became glaringly clear, especially when it came to the forums and supposed threats DM had allegedly made. None of it held up. The judge wasn't impressed with APS's theatrics, dismissing most of their claims outright. By the time the dust settled, APS had no choice but to remove the boot and walk away, heads hung low. Their defeat was undeniable, and while they didn't admit it, their humiliation was plain for everyone to see. DM had stood his ground, and APS left the courtroom with nothing but a bruised ego. But APS wasn't content to just take the loss and move on. No, they decided to double down on their pettiness in a way that reeked of desperation and vindictiveness. Their response to losing against DM was to punish his entire neighborhood. One morning, the community woke up to a sight that felt more like a coordinated attack than a parking enforcement effort. Dozens of cars booted all at once. If a car wasn't parked in the garage or pressed up to the edge of the driveway, it was slapped with a boot. It didn't matter if you'd parked there for years without issue or if there was no clear violation. APS made the rules up as they went, and this time, the rules seemed to be punish everyone and see what sticks. DM's neighbors were livid, and my coworker Tim was among the unlucky ones caught in the chaos. He found his car booted even though it had been parked no differently than usual. The neighborhood erupted into a storm of outrage, with residents storming out of their homes to confront APS's smug-looking enforcers. People demanded explanations, but APS offered none, just vague mumblings about compliance and policy. The entire community had been turned into a war zone overnight, and the anger was palpable. APS had crossed a line, and now they weren't just dealing with DM. They were facing a neighborhood that was ready to go to war. The tension was thick, and you could feel the collective frustration brewing into something dangerous. Tim described the chaos vividly. I came outside, coffee in hand, and there's this guy in an APS uniform just casually slapping a boot on my car like it's no big deal. I asked him what the hell he was doing, and he just pointed to some bogus rule about driveway lengths. Meanwhile, my neighbor, Dave, was already shouting at another APS guy down the street. It was like a war zone. Calls to the HOA yielded nothing but vague apologies and finger-pointing. We didn't authorize this, they claimed, but no one believed them. APS acted with impunity, and the HOAs seemed either complicit or too spineless to intervene. The neighborhood banded together, filing complaints and threatening lawsuits. But APS didn't care. They knew they could get away with it because challenging them in court was expensive and time-consuming. Most people reluctantly paid the fines just to get the boots removed, further fueling APS's reign of terror. Years later, karma finally came for APS. Some enterprising hacker discovered a vulnerability in their website, a poorly secured admin login page, and exploited it to expose their shady practices. APS's entire database was dumped online, and their reputation took a massive hit. Their site went offline for weeks, and when it came back, it was barely functional, like a relic from the early 2000s. Even now, APS hasn't learned a thing. They're still out there, skulking around neighborhoods, preying on unsuspecting residents and cozying up to HOAs. They thrive on fear and compliance, using shady tactics to squeeze every last dollar out of people who just want to park their cars in peace. But despite their continued antics, the legend of Dolly Man refuses to fade. His act of defiance wasn't just a personal victory. It became a rallying cry for anyone who's ever been on the receiving end of HOA or APS nonsense. Every time I think about DM calmly rolling his booted car into the garage, it's impossible not to grin. It wasn't just the act itself. It was the sheer confidence, the refusal to play their ridiculous game. He didn't yell, didn't rage. He just took their weapon of control and rendered it useless, leaving APS scrambling like a bunch of amateurs. That moment became more than just a neighborhood story. It was a symbol of standing up to bullies in suits, of reminding them that not everyone will roll over and pay up without a fight. And honestly, knowing that APS probably still seethes about it to this day. That's the cherry on top. They wanted obedience, and instead, they got Dolly Man, a one-man rebellion who left their petty, power-hungry operation looking ridiculous. What kind of dystopian nightmare is this? An HOA that works with a company to basically steal from its residents is insane. APS sounds like a mafia group more than a parking company. And the HOA stood by while they harassed Dolly Man? If anything, this proves HOAs are nothing more than enablers for scams. If you're paying HOA fees, shouldn't that money go toward actually helping the residents, not siding with a shady company to bully people into paying for fake violations? Makes me glad I'll never live in one of these hellscapes. Let's break this down. APS boots Dolly Man's car for no reason. HOA does nothing. Dolly Man does something and smart, uses dollies to move his car. APS goes full toddler tantrum and starts booting everyone else's cars. Meanwhile, the HOA stays completely useless. What's the point of an HOA if they won't stand up for their own residents? Instead, they just help APS harass an entire neighborhood. If there's a worse combination than HOAs and shady companies like APS, I'd love to hear it. Actually, no, I wouldn't. I've seen enough stupidity for one day. The HOA in this story is a prime example of everything that's wrong with these organizations. They're supposed to be there to help the community, but instead, they act like a bunch of tyrants. DM was just trying to park his car, and they couldn't even back him up when he got booted unfairly. It's like they're more interested in enforcing ridiculous rules than actually helping their residents. The fact that they sided with shows how out of touch they are with reality. It's insane that people pay fees for this kind of nonsense.
I would like to thank you for watching the video to the end. To encourage us to make more videos, please like, subscribe, comment, as well as share. Check out this other video if you haven't already.